1. Hasty pudding hook statement. It was once so common in America that children sang songs about it, families relied on it for survival, and even presidents had bowls of it placed on their tables. Yet today, most Americans have never even heard of hasty pudding. Historical background context. The dish traces its origins back to the Old World, where puddings meant any thickened grain porridge. When settlers arrived in the New World, they didn't have wheat flour in abundance, but they did have corn. Native Americans had long shown them how to grind it into meal, and from that, the colonists created their own version of pudding. By the late 1600s and well into the 1700s, hasty pudding became one of the most iconic dishes in early American kitchens. It was simple. Cornmeal boiled in water or milk, sometimes sweetened with molasses or flavored with a bit of spice if the family could afford it. Why it mattered or was popular. This dish wasn't just food, it was survival. Corn grew in harsh soils where wheat could not. For poorer families, hasty pudding was often breakfast, lunch, and supper. For wealthier households, it could be dressed up with cream, butter, or even eggs to give it more richness. Everyone knew it, everyone ate it, and for nearly 2 centuries, it was as American as apple pie would later become. Emotional or shocking twist, and yet, despite its central role in the nation's history, hasty pudding quietly disappeared. By the mid-1800s, changing tastes, the availability of wheat, and the rise of refined sugar meant that cornmeal porridge began to feel old-fashioned, a food associated with poverty rather than pride. Today, the only time many people hear the words hasty pudding is in the name of a Harvard theater club, not in their grandmother's kitchen. What was once the lifeblood of colonial America has become a culinary ghost, remembered only in songs and faded cookbooks. Smooth transition to next section. But hasty pudding wasn't the only dish that carried America through its early days. In fact, some recipes leaned more toward comfort than survival, and few dishes capture that better than the next forgotten classic, the sweet, sizzling treat known as Indian slapjacks. Number 2, Indian slapjacks hook statement. Long before pancakes became a fluffy breakfast indulgence smothered in maple syrup, early Americans were flipping something much humbler in their frying pans, Indian slapjacks. Historical background context. The name can be a little confusing today. Indian in early cookbooks almost always meant cornmeal, since it was the grain first taught to settlers by Native Americans. And slapjacks referred to flat cakes or fritters fried quickly in a pan. So Indian slapjacks were, in essence, cornmeal pancakes, thin, dense, and sizzling in bacon fat or lard. They appeared in Amelia Simmons' American Cookery of 1796, the very first cookbook written and published in the United States. Her recipe was simple: cornmeal, water, a little salt, and sometimes molasses to sweeten. The batter was poured into a hot skillet, slapped down flat, and cooked until golden on both sides. Why it mattered or was popular. Indian slapjacks weren't just breakfast food, they were travel food. They cooked quickly, required few ingredients, and could be eaten hot or cold. Farmers ate them in the fields, sailors carried them on long voyages, and pioneers packed them in wagons heading west. For many Americans, these corn cakes were the closest thing to a reliable staple that could be dressed up or down, served plain with butter, dipped into stew, or drizzled with honey if it was available. They represented adaptability, a reflection of a young nation making do with what it had. Emotional or shocking twist. But like so many early dishes, Indian slapjacks eventually fell out of fashion. As wheat flour became more accessible and chemical leaveners like baking soda appeared in kitchens, Americans developed a taste for lighter, fluffier breads. Cornmeal flapjacks began to feel rustic, even poor. By the mid-1800s, the slapjack was being pushed aside in favor of pancakes made with refined flour. Today, it's almost vanished, lingering only in old recipe books or among historians who specialize in colonial cooking. The very recipe that once fueled pioneers now exists mostly as a curiosity, forgotten even as its descendant, the pancake, sits at the center of the American breakfast table. Smooth transition to next section. If Indian slapjacks were the food of the working class, our next lost recipe belonged to celebration. It was massive, spiced, and rich with meaning. A cake baked not for birthdays, but for democracy itself. Let's step into the world of the legendary election cake. Election cake hook statement. Imagine a cake so big, so spiced, and so deeply tied to civic duty that it was baked not for birthdays or weddings, but for election day. This was the forgotten tradition of election cake. Historical background context. The roots of election cake reach back to the late 1700s when voting day was more than just a trip to the polls. It was a community gathering. In a time before secret ballots and quick counts, elections could take days, and voters often traveled miles to the nearest courthouse or town square. To feed the crowds, women baked enormous cakes. The first printed recipe appeared in Amelia Simmons' American Cookery in 1796, but the idea was even older, tied to English great cakes made for holidays. American election cake was a heavy yeast-leavened cake made with flour, butter, sugar, eggs, molasses, brandy, and a riot of spices: nutmeg, cinnamon, and cloves, often studded with dried fruits. It was hearty enough to last several days and large enough to feed dozens. Why it mattered or was popular. Election cake wasn't just dessert, it was civic fuel. Early America didn't have political ads, TV debates, or glossy posters. It had gathering, feasting, and food traditions that made participation memorable. Election cake became a symbol of community, patriotism, and abundance in the young republic. For women who couldn't yet vote, it was also one of the few ways they could directly contribute to the rituals of democracy. A good election cake was a mark of both skill and pride, reminding voters that the act of choosing leaders was a celebration, not just a duty. Emotional or shocking twist, but like many early traditions, election cake faded away. As the nation grew, elections became more regulated, less of a festival and more of a private duty. By the mid-1800s, the communal feasting aspect was gone. Election cake slipped into obscurity, remembered only in old cookbooks and faded notes in women's diaries. Today, few Americans know that at one time, casting a ballot might also mean cutting into a slice of warm, spiced cake baked in the name of liberty. It is a piece of democracy's culinary history that has vanished from our tables, even as the right to vote remains central to our identity. Smooth transition to next section. From the spice-laden election cake, we turn to a dessert that was lighter, frothier, and once considered the height of elegance. Our next forgotten dish was a theatrical mix of cream and wine, whipped into a foamy delight, the whimsical syllabub. Syllabub hook statement. Picture this: a silver bowl filled with frothy cream, bubbling with wine, and served with a flourish at candlelit tables. For nearly 2 centuries, this whimsical treat, called syllabub, was the height of elegance. Historical background context. Syllabub was not an American invention. It came over from England, where it had been a fashionable dessert since the 1500s. Early colonists brought the recipe across the Atlantic, and by the 1700s it appeared in American cookbooks, including Amelia Simmons' American Cookery. The dish was deceptively simple: cream whipped together with sugar, lemon zest, and white wine or cider until it frothed into a foamy cloud. Sometimes it was sipped like a drink. Other times it was scooped like a pudding. Wealthier families might even serve it in fine glassware, showing off the layers of foam and liquid beneath. Why it mattered or was popular. In a world before ice cream was common, syllabub was dazzling. It was sweet, it was light, and it had an almost magical quality as the cream thickened and floated atop the wine. At dinner parties, it wasn't just a dessert, it was a performance. Guests marveled at its texture, at how something so rich could feel so airy. And because it contained wine, It carried a playful indulgence, the sort of treat that blurred the line between drink and dessert. For colonial hosts, it was a chance to show sophistication, blending old world tradition with new world abundance. Emotional or shocking twist. But fashions change quickly. By the early 1800s, syllabub was falling out of favor. More refined desserts like jellies, custards, and eventually ice cream took its place. What had once been a symbol of elegance began to feel outdated, too rustic, too messy, too simple. By the end of the 19th century, syllabub had all but vanished from American tables. Today, it survives mainly as a historical curiosity, an oddity in the footnotes of cookbooks. Few realize that this frothy concoction was once a showstopper, as familiar in its time as apple pie is today. Smooth transition to next section, but not all early American sweets were airy and whimsical. Some were dense, sticky, and made to last. Our next forgotten recipe is one that's still faintly remembered in Pennsylvania Dutch country, but its original form was far richer and bolder than the versions we know today. The deep, molasses-heavy shoe fly pie. Hat 5. Shoe fly pie. Hook statement. It's one of those dishes whose name alone makes you smile. Shoe fly pie. Today, many know it as a quaint Pennsylvania Dutch dessert. But the truth is, the original version was far richer, darker, and almost unrecognizable compared to what's left of it now. Historical background/context. Shoe fly pie was born out of necessity in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially among German immigrants in Pennsylvania. Sugar was expensive, fruit was seasonal, and flour wasn't always available in abundance. But molasses, that deep, sticky byproduct of sugar refining, was cheap and plentiful. Out of it came a pie that didn't require eggs, fruit, or even refrigeration. The earliest versions weren't really pies at all, but more like sticky molasses cakes baked in a crust. Called Molasses Ruwelkuche in dialect, or molasses crumb cake, it was sturdy, sweet, and filling. It earned its whimsical English nickname because the thick molasses attracted flies that had to be shooed away as it cooled on windowsills. Why it mattered, or was popular. For farmers and working families, shoe fly pie was survival food. It lasted for days without spoiling, traveled well, and provided quick energy for laborers in the fields. Unlike delicate pastries or imported sweets, this was a truly American creation, born from thrift and practicality. But it was also celebratory. On Sundays, a slice of shoe fly pie with coffee was a treat, a little luxury carved from everyday ingredients. Over time, it became a symbol of Pennsylvania Dutch culture, a dish that represented resilience, simplicity, and ingenuity. Emotional or shocking twist. The shoe fly pie most Americans know today, the light, crumbly version often sold at tourist shops, is a shadow of its former self. The original was darker, denser, and almost overpoweringly rich with molasses. It wasn't a polite dessert for dainty slices. It was heavy, sticky, and unapologetic. Yet as tastes shifted toward refined sugar, as tourism reshaped Pennsylvania Dutch cuisine into something more marketable, the pie itself was sweetened, softened, and diluted. What we eat today is nostalgia polished up for show. The true shoe fly pie, the one that fueled generations, has all but vanished from American kitchens. Smooth transition to next section, but not all forgotten recipes were born from thrift. Some came from refinement, dishes meant to impress at dinner parties in the nation's earliest years. Our next lost recipe is one such example, a delicately wrapped dish of fish and pastry, once prized at the tables of America's early elite, salmon in pastry. 6. Salmon in pastry hook statement. Long before beef Wellington became a byword for elegance, America's first cookbooks recorded a dish just as refined, salmon in pastry. It was a showpiece meant not for survival, but for display. Historical background context. Salmon had a special place in early American cuisine. In the 1700s and early 1800s, rivers from New England to the mid-Atlantic teemed with it, making salmon both abundant and affordable. But when it appeared on the tables of the wealthy, it wasn't served plainly. Inspired by French and English cookery, Amelia Simmons' American Cookery, 1796, included directions for wrapping a salmon fillet in pastry, brushing it with butter, and baking it until golden. Sometimes the fish was filled with herbs, eggs, or oysters before being sealed inside. When sliced open, the flaky crust revealed tender pink fish, steaming and aromatic. Why it mattered or was popular. In a young nation still shaping its identity, salmon in pastry was food as theater. At Federalist dinner parties and elite gatherings, the dish signaled refinement and a connection to European tradition. It wasn't just about taste, it was about showing that American tables could rival the sophistication of London or Paris. For hosts, serving salmon and pastry meant they had the means to afford delicate fish, fine flour, butter, and the labor required to prepare it. It turned a common river catch into a symbol of status. Emotional or shocking twist. But this elegant dish did not survive the test of time. Industrialization, overfishing, and pollution depleted salmon stocks in many rivers by the late 1800s. At the same time, changing tastes moved away from heavy pastry-wrapped meats and fish. By the 20th century, salmon and pastry had almost disappeared from American cookbooks. What was once a centerpiece of refinement is now little more than a footnote, overshadowed by its beef counterpart. Most Americans would be astonished to learn that a dish so refined once graced the tables of their nation's earliest leaders. Smooth transition to next section. But not every forgotten dish was reserved for high society. Some were hearty, portable, and sold on the streets to travelers and workers alike. Our next recipe was one such treasure, a hollowed loaf of bread packed with oysters, known simply as the oyster loaf. 7. Oyster loaf hook statement. It may sound simple, bread stuffed with oysters, but in the 1800s, the oyster loaf was a street food sensation, a traveler's comfort, and a dish that tells the story of a very different America. Historical background context. In the 19th century, oysters were everywhere. Cheap, plentiful, and harvested from the Atlantic coast and Gulf waters, they were called the poor man's protein. Cities like New York, Philadelphia, and New Orleans had oyster houses on nearly every corner. But one of the most ingenious ways to serve them was the oyster loaf. Bakers or street vendors would take a round loaf of bread, hollow it out, stuff it with fried or stewed oysters, and wrap it for travelers on the go. Sometimes seasoned with butter, pepper, or parsley, the loaf became both the container and the meal. It was the perfect handheld food, filling, portable, and easy to eat without utensils. Why it mattered, or was popular. The oyster loaf was more than food. It was convenience before the age of fast food. Hungry dock workers could buy one on their way home, and stagecoach passengers often carried them on long journeys. In New Orleans, the dish became particularly beloved, sometimes linked to the origins of the famous po' boy sandwich. For many working-class Americans, oysters weren't a luxury but an everyday staple, and the loaf was one of the cleverest ways to enjoy them. Emotional or shocking twist. And yet today, oysters are a delicacy, often served on ice at high-end restaurants. The idea that they were once cheaper than beef or chicken feels almost unbelievable. Overharvesting, pollution, and demand devastated oyster beds by the early 20th century, driving up prices and making oysters scarce. As oysters became luxury food, the humble oyster loaf disappeared. A dish that once filled the hands of hungry travelers and dock workers is now gone, remembered only in old menus and faded newspaper ads. What was once common street food is now almost unimaginable. Smooth transition to next section. From the bustling streets, let's move to the battlefields of history. Our next lost dish wasn't just comfort food. It was called the stew that won the revolution. Thick, spicy, and unforgettable, it was the legendary pepper pot soup. 8. Pepper pot soup hook statement. On a freezing winter day in 1777, with soldiers starving and morale crumbling, George Washington's army was saved not by weapons, but by a stew. It was called pepper pot soup, and it would forever be remembered as the stew that won the revolution. Historical background context. The story begins at Valley Forge. The Continental Army was cold, mugged, hungry, and worn down. Supplies were scarce, and traditional rations like bread and meat were almost impossible to come by. Into this struggle stepped the camp's cooks, many of them drawing on Caribbean and African traditions of resourceful cooking. They created pepper pot soup, a hot, spicy stew made from whatever could be found, most famously tripe, the stomach lining of cattle, vegetables, peppers, and spices. What made it stand out was its bold heat, a sharp contrast to the bland gruels and porridges soldiers were used to. Why it mattered or was popular? Pepper pot soup mattered because it was morale in a bowl. Soldiers who had gone hungry suddenly had something hot, hearty, and full of flavor. According to legend, George Washington himself praised the dish for keeping the army together through that brutal winter. After the Revolution, pepper pot soup became associated with Philadelphia, where it was sold by street vendors well into the 1800s. It was a dish that carried the flavors of the Caribbean into the heart of America, reminding everyone that the Revolution had not just military heroes, but culinary ones as well. Emotional or shocking twist, but time has a way of burying even the most heroic foods. By the late 19th century, pepper pot soup was fading. The use of tripe became less appealing to modern tastes, and canned soups from big companies like Campbell's began replacing traditional recipes. Even Campbell's, which once sold pepper pot soup nationwide, discontinued it in the 1970s due to lack of demand. A dish that once symbolized survival and victory has nearly vanished, remembered now only in museums and old cookbooks. It is a reminder that even food that shaped history can be forgotten when tastes change. Smooth transition to next section. From the spicy battlefield stew that kept soldiers alive, we move to something simpler, an everyday fuel for farmers, pioneers, and soldiers alike. Gritty, hearty, and endlessly adaptable, it was the humble Johnny Cake. Johnny Cake's hook statement. Before the fluffy stack of pancakes became America's breakfast sweetheart, there was a grittier, simpler ancestor, the Johnny Cake. This humble cornmeal flatbread fed soldiers, pioneers, and farmers long before diners served syrupy stacks. Historical background context. The roots of the Johnny Cake stretch back to indigenous traditions. Native Americans had long been grinding maize into meal and cooking it over open fires. European settlers learned from them, adapting the method into what they called journey cakes, or Johnny Cakes. They were simple. Cornmeal mixed with water and salt, sometimes enriched with milk or fat if available, then baked on a flat stone, griddle, or cast iron skillet. Crisp on the outside, tender inside, Johnny Cakes became one of the first truly American breads. They required no yeast, no wheat, and no elaborate tools, just fire, cornmeal, and patience. Why it mattered or was popular? Johnny Cakes were survival food. During the Revolutionary War, soldiers ate them in camp. Pioneers carried them on westward journeys, knowing cornmeal would last longer than wheat flour. On farms, they were an everyday staple, eaten with molasses, butter, or alongside soups and stews. For working families, Johnny Cakes were affordable, filling, and endlessly versatile. They carried with them a sense of self-reliance. The idea that a family could grind their own corn, bake their own bread, and sustain themselves without outside help. Emotional or shocking twist. But in time, Johnny Cakes began to feel too rustic for modern America. Wheat flour became cheap, baking powder and soda introduced fluffier breads, and pancakes rose in popularity as the lighter, sweeter breakfast option. By the late 19th century, the Johnny Cake was already slipping into the shadows. Today, a few regional traditions keep it alive in Rhode Island, New England, and parts of the South, but most Americans have never tasted one. The bread that once carried pioneers across the frontier is now little more than a relic, a forgotten ancestor to the foods we know today. Smooth transition to next section. But not all early recipes were humble or rustic. Some reached for refinement, blending French influence with American ingredients. Our next forgotten dish is one such example, a delicate, elaborate entree once praised in early cookbooks, the ragout of pigeons. Section 10, Ragout of Pigeons. Hook statement. It might sound unusual to us now, but in the 18th and early 19th centuries, one of the most refined dishes you could serve your guests was ragout of pigeons. What we see as common birds were once considered a delicacy on America's earliest tables. Historical background, context. The recipe for ragout of pigeons appears in Amelia Simmons' American Cookery, 1796, and in other early cookbooks inspired by European traditions. Ragout was a French term for a richly seasoned stew or braised dish, often served with a sauce thickened by butter, wine, or cream. In this case, the star ingredient was the pigeon, specifically the passenger pigeon, a bird that once darkened American skies in flocks numbering millions. Cooked with herbs, onions, mushrooms, and wine, the pigeons were braised until tender, and then presented in a dish meant to show elegance and sophistication. For a young nation, drawing on French culinary style was a way of asserting refinement while using ingredients abundant in the New World. Why it mattered or was popular, ragout of pigeons was not just about sustenance, it was about status. To serve such a dish suggested access to both quality ingredients and the knowledge of fashionable cooking methods. Wealthier households and inns in growing cities often included it on their menus, signaling that America could rival Europe in both taste and culture. At the same time, pigeons were cheap and plentiful. For working families, pigeon stew in simpler forms was common, though not as richly prepared as the French-inspired ragout. It was a dish that straddled both worlds, luxury for the elite, practicality for the common man. Emotional or shocking twist. What makes ragout of pigeons truly haunting is not just that it vanished from our tables, but that its star ingredient vanished from the earth. The passenger pigeon, once the most numerous bird in North America, was hunted to extinction by the early 20th century. A dish that had once been ordinary became impossible, a symbol of abundance lost forever. What was once a staple in America's first cookbooks is now a ghost of two histories, one culinary, one environmental. Few foods so vividly remind us how quickly abundance can disappear. Smooth transition to next section. From the refined tables of the elite, we move back to the humble kitchens of everyday families. Some dishes weren't about elegance or performance. They were about comfort and survival. Few capture that better than the simple daily bowl of mush and milk. Number 11, mush and milk, the humble farmhouse breakfast. There was a time in America when almost every farmhouse table saw the same simple dish appear morning after morning, mush and milk. Today, it sounds almost too plain to be remembered, but for generations, this quiet staple was a symbol of survival, practicality, and comfort. Mush itself was nothing complicated. It was usually made from cornmeal slowly boiled in water until it thickened into a porridge. Some families cooked it down to a creamy consistency, while others let it firm up, slicing it later to fry in a skillet. Once ready, it was poured into a bowl and topped with cold milk, sometimes straight from the barn that morning, still rich with cream. That was it. No sugar, no spice, no fancy extras, unless the family happened to have molasses, butter, or a sprinkle of salt to spare. For farm families, mush and milk wasn't just food, it was ritual. Early in the morning, after long hours tending to chores, children would gather at the table, spoons clinking against tin bowls. The meal filled stomachs without emptying wallets, and it used what farms already had: ground corn and fresh dairy. It was cheap, dependable, and endlessly repeatable. Many who grew up with mush and milk remembered it with mixed feelings. On one hand, it was monotonous. Day after day, the same bland bowl awaited them. On the other, it became part of their identity, proof of thrift, of making do, and of finding nourishment in the simplest of things. Some even looked back with fond nostalgia, recalling the creamy corn flavor softened by fresh milk as a kind of forgotten comfort food. The dish eventually faded from daily life as packaged cereals, store-bought breads, and sugar-laden breakfasts took over American kitchens. By the mid-20th century, mush and milk seemed like a relic from another world, remembered mostly by those who grew up during the Great Depression or on self-sufficient farms. Today, it rarely appears outside of old cookbooks or family memories. And yet, in its quiet way, mush and milk tells the story of a country that once valued resourcefulness over convenience. A dish that cost pennies, fed families, and kept the rhythms of farm life going strong. Apple tansy, a forgotten colonial breakfast. Apple tansy is one of those dishes that almost sounds like a storybook name, something you'd imagine being served on a rustic wooden table in the early morning with the smell of wood smoke in the air. And that image wouldn't be far from the truth. The dish dates back to colonial America, though its origins trace even earlier to England. Families who settled in the colonies brought their simple recipes with them, and apple tansy was among them. The name itself comes from tansy, a green herb with a bitter taste that was once believed to have health benefits. But over time, the tansy and apple tansy became less about the herb and more about the style of dish, a kind of sweet omelet made with fruit. The recipe was incredibly simple and made use of what was almost always on hand in early American kitchens: eggs, butter, sugar, and apples. To make apple tansy, slices of tart apples were fried in butter until tender. Then a mixture of beaten eggs, a splash of milk, and a sprinkle of sugar and nutmeg was poured over the apples, cooking into a golden, slightly sweet custard-like dish. Some versions were flipped like a pancake. Others were served more like a soft baked pudding. It was a versatile meal. It could be served hot for breakfast, eaten hot for breakfast, eaten cold as a midday snack, or even treated as a humble dessert at the end of a long day. For colonial families where every ingredient had to stretch, this dish provided protein from the eggs, energy from the apples, and just enough sweetness to feel like a treat. Apple tansy also reflects the ingenuity of early American cooking, how families combined old world traditions with new world ingredients. Apples thrived in the colonies, and every homestead had access to them. Preserving apples was common, so even in winter, a dish like apple tansy was possible. Today, apple tansy has all but disappeared. It rarely shows up in cookbooks, and few people even know the name. Yet it represents a time when meals were simple, resourceful, and comforting, created not with fancy ingredients, but with what was available. Imagine a flickering candle on a wooden table, a cast iron skillet set over the hearth, and the warm scent of apples and nutmeg filling a small farmhouse kitchen. That was apple tansy, a dish of warmth, thrift, and forgotten history. Haberschnar 13, calf's foot jelly. There are some dishes that truly remind us of how different the past was, and calf's foot jelly is one of them. Today, the very idea might sound unusual, even unappetizing, but for centuries this dish was considered both a delicacy and a health food. In fact, it was one of the most common desserts in 18th and 19th century America and Europe, showing up in cookbooks, family recipe collections, and even on the tables of the wealthy. The process of making calf's foot jelly was long and painstaking. Families would begin with cleaned calves' feet, hooves and all, simmering them in water for hours on end until the tough connective tissue and bones released their natural gelatin. This thick, sticky broth was then strained, clarified with egg whites, and flavored with ingredients like lemon juice, Madeira wine, cinnamon, or nutmeg. Once poured into molds and cooled, the liquid solidified into a shimmering, wobbly jelly, often golden or amber in color. To 19th century families, calf's foot jelly wasn't just dessert. It was believed to have restorative powers. Doctors recommended it for invalids, the elderly, and women recovering from childbirth. Newspapers and domestic manuals described it as a strengthening food, one that could rebuild energy and soothe digestion. Some even swore by it as a beauty treatment, claiming it improved the skin because of its natural collagen. But Calf's foot jelly was not limited to the sick room. On well to do tables, it appeared in elaborate molds, sometimes layered with cream or fruit, sparkling in candlelight as a sign of refinement. In humbler households, it was more practical, a way of using every part of the animal, making sure nothing went to waste. By the early 20th century, however, its popularity began to decline. The invention of powdered gelatin in the 1890s, think Jello, made it easier and cheaper to make molded desserts without the messy, time consuming process of boiling calves' feet. Add in the rise of more modern sweets like cakes, pies, and puddings, and calf's foot jelly gradually disappeared from American kitchens. Today, the dish survives mostly as a curiosity, a reminder of how resourceful earlier generations were. While we might reach for a brightly colored box of Jell-O, our ancestors were creating their own version, rich, nutritious, and steeped in tradition. 14. White pot bread pudding. If you stepped into an English country kitchen in the 17th or 18th century, the sight of a white pot cooling on the table would not have seemed unusual. Today, we might call it bread pudding, but in its time, it was a dish that straddled the line between thrift and indulgence. At its heart, white pot was a way to make use of stale bread, transforming something humble and unremarkable into a dish that could feel both filling and celebratory. Families would tear or slice leftover bread and layer it in an earthenware dish, sometimes with dried fruits like currants or raisins if they could afford them. Then came the custard, milk or cream gently warmed, beaten with eggs, a bit of sugar, and sometimes a pinch of spice like nutmeg or cinnamon. Poured over the bread, the mixture soaked in before being baked until golden on top and soft within. The name white pot likely came from its pale custard base, contrasted with darker puddings of the time, such as those rich with suet, molasses, or treacle. Unlike those heavier fare, white pot was lighter, easier on the stomach, and adaptable to what was available in the pantry. In wealthier households, the dish might be enriched with plenty of cream, butter, or candied peel. In more modest kitchens, it was pared down to bread, milk, and an egg or two. Yet in both cases, it carried the same comfort, a warm, sweet dish that turned scraps into satisfaction. White pot also had a symbolic place in English cookery. It was often prepared for Sunday dinners, holidays, or as a reward after harvest, reminding families that even modest resources could create something that felt special. Its evolution into what we now know as bread pudding is a testament to its enduring charm. Though largely forgotten in modern kitchens, white pot reminds us of an era when frugality and creativity met in the oven, producing a dish that managed to be both practical and delightful, a true example of making do with a touch of sweetness. 15. Chicken pie with oysters. In colonial America, few dishes carried the same sense of occasion and indulgence as chicken pie with oysters. It was not an everyday meal, but rather a centerpiece for feasts, holidays, and moments of abundance. The combination might sound unusual to modern tastes, but to people of the 18th and early 19th centuries, chicken and oysters represented both comfort and refinement. Oysters, in particular, were once far more common than they are today. They could be harvested in great numbers along the eastern seaboard, and in port cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, they were so plentiful that even working-class families could afford them. Chicken, on the other hand, was a more precious food. Chickens laid eggs year-round, but slaughtering a hen meant losing her future eggs, so families reserved chicken meat for special occasions. When paired together in a pie, these two ingredients symbolized both prosperity and celebration. The dish itself was a layered affair. A cook would stew the chicken gently, often with onion, herbs, and a bit of wine or broth, until the meat was tender enough to fall from the bone. The oysters were shucked and left raw, their briny liquor saved to enrich the sauce. A gravy was made from the chicken drippings, thickened with flour or butter and seasoned with nutmeg, pepper, and sometimes mace, spices that hinted at English culinary traditions. Then came the pie assembly. In a deep dish, the chicken was layered with oysters, with the savory gravy poured over. Finally, it was sealed beneath a sturdy crust of pastry, sometimes a puff crust, sometimes a simple flour and lard dough, and baked until golden. When it emerged from the oven, the pie was a showpiece. Steam rising, crust gleaming, rich aromas of roasted poultry and sea mingling together. To eat chicken pie with oysters was to experience a collision of land and sea, farmyard and coastline, humble thrift and luxurious flavor. It was common at weddings, church suppers, and even on the tables of the founding fathers. Records show that such pies appeared in menus at Mount Vernon and Monticello. In taverns, a hearty slice was washed down with ale, while in genteel homes it might be paired with Madeira wine. Over time, the dish faded from American kitchens. Chickens became more common, while oysters, once cheap, grew scarce due to overharvesting and pollution. By the late 19th century, the oyster was no longer a food of the people, but of the elite. The marriage of chicken and oyster in a single pie seemed out of place in a changing food culture, and gradually it disappeared from cookbooks and tables alike. Today, reviving chicken pie with oysters feels almost like uncovering a forgotten treasure. It is a reminder of how resourceful and celebratory early Americans were with their food, willing to combine what the land and sea provided into one communal dish. Though few kitchens attempt it now, the memory of chicken pie with oysters lingers as a taste of the old, festive America.